They were feared across continents, praised by kings, and turned into legends by their enemies. But the truth about Persia's immortal guard is far more strategic, political, and human than the myth suggests. The myth of the 10,000 immortals has captivated minds for over 2 millennia. Greek historians like Herodotus painted them as an unstoppable force, a military machine that never diminished in number. When one fell, another instantly took his place, as if death itself had no claim over them. Persian sources added layers of mystique, describing warriors adorned in gold and silver, moving with supernatural discipline across the vast expanse of the Achaemenid Empire. This fusion of Greek fascination and Persian grandeur created an aura almost otherworldly around these elite soldiers. But who were they really? Behind the legends stood professional soldiers drawn from Persian and Median aristocracy, men who served as the empire's ultimate insurance policy. They were not mythical beings, but instruments of imperial power. Bodyguards to the great king, shock troops on the battlefield, and political tools in the endless intrigues of the royal court. Their existence reflected the Achaemenid genius for organization, propaganda, and the consolidation of diverse peoples under a single throne. Revisiting this history matters because it reveals how propaganda, culture, and warfare intertwine to transform reality into legend. The Immortals were products of their time, shaped by the military needs of a sprawling empire, the political demands of absolute monarchy, and the cultural values of ancient Persia. Understanding them means understanding how empires project power, how myths are manufactured, and how a single military unit can echo through centuries, inspiring both admiration and imitation. If you want to uncover the real story behind history's most famous warriors, subscribe to help us reach 2,000 subscribers. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us which Persian-themed film you enjoyed most. Your engagement keeps these stories alive. What transformed a royal guard unit into an eternal symbol of invincibility? The answer begins not with legends, but with the violent birth of the world's first true superpower. The mid-6th century BCE presented a fragmented Near East, a patchwork of kingdoms, city-states, and tribal confederations locked in perpetual competition. Mesopotamia remained divided between the Neo-Babylonian Empire and various smaller powers. The Median Empire controlled the Iranian plateau but lacked cohesive administration. Lydia dominated Anatolia with its legendary wealth, while Egypt stood as an ancient power watching nervously as new players emerged. This political fragmentation created both opportunity and danger. Opportunity for ambitious rulers to expand, danger for those who failed to adapt. Into this volatile landscape stepped Cyrus II of Persia, later known as Cyrus the Great. His genius lay not merely in military conquest, but in his unprecedented ability to blend force with diplomacy. Where previous conquerors relied solely on terror and subjugation, Cyrus understood the power of legitimacy. He presented himself as a liberator rather than an oppressor, respecting local customs, religions, and administrative structures. When he conquered Babylon in 539 BCE, he famously freed the Jews from captivity and allowed them to return to Jerusalem, a calculated move that earned him loyalty across diverse populations. Cyrus's unification of the Persian tribes marked the beginning of something extraordinary. He overthrew his Median overlords around 550 BCE, but rather than destroying Median culture, he absorbed it. Median nobles found places in his administration. Median military traditions merged with Persian innovations. This pattern would repeat itself across every conquest. Absorb, integrate, and build something greater than the sum of its parts. The result was an empire that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, the largest the world had ever seen. But empire building created a fundamental problem that no amount of diplomacy could solve alone. How do you control territories spanning thousands of miles, encompassing dozens of languages, religions, and cultures? How do you maintain order when every conquered people harbors resentment? when ambitious governors eye independence, when rivals plot in the shadows. Previous empires had collapsed precisely because they lacked the infrastructure to maintain what they conquered. Cyrus understood that an empire required more than conquest. It demanded constant, professional military presence. The solution was revolutionary for its time: a standing army, permanently mobilized and directly loyal to the crown. Most ancient armies were seasonal affairs, farmers called to war during campaign months and returning home for harvest. Such forces worked for raids and short conflicts, but proved useless for garrisoning distant provinces or responding rapidly to rebellions. Cyrus needed soldiers who were always ready, always trained, always available. He needed professionals. Even more critically, he needed an inner circle of absolute loyalty. The royal court became a snake pit of competing interests. Persian nobles jealous of their status, Median aristocrats resentful of subordination, Babylonian priests scheming for influence, Greek mercenaries selling their swords to the highest bidder. In this environment, the king's personal security couldn't be entrusted to rotating militias or foreign auxiliaries. He needed guardians bound by blood, culture, and self-interest to his survival. The earliest references to elite troops in the Achaemenid court appear in fragmentary sources from Cyrus's reign and expand under his successor Cambyses II. These weren't yet the fully formed Immortals of later fame, but rather the prototype, Persian and Median nobles serving in rotating shifts around the royal person, equipped at personal expense with the finest weapons and armor. Their dual role as bodyguards and shock troops emerged from practical necessity. The same men who protected the king at court needed to prove their worth on campaign, demonstrating that their privilege came from merit, not merely birth. Imperial logistics drove standardization. An empire spanning 3,000 miles required unprecedented coordination. Messages had to travel swiftly along the royal road. Garrisons needed regular supply, and military units required instant recognizability. The famous Persian postal system, which would later inspire similar systems in Rome and beyond, demanded stations every 15 miles with fresh horses and riders. Military forces needed comparable organization. Standardized equipment, uniform training, and centralized command became imperial necessities rather than tactical preferences. The conflicts that forged this elite force began almost immediately. Cyrus's war against Croesus of Lydia in 547 BCE tested Persian military organization against one of the era's wealthiest kingdoms. The Lydian cavalry, legendary for its skill, met Persian infantry tactics that emphasized coordinated archery and disciplined spear formations. The capture of Sardis, Lydia's seemingly impregnable capital, demonstrated that Persian forces could overcome any obstacle when properly organized and led. The Median Wars proved even more formative. When Cyrus overthrew his grandfather Astyages, he faced experienced soldiers who had dominated the region for decades. Victory required not just defeating them, but absorbing them, turning potential enemies into loyal servants. The creation of mixed Persian-Median units, officered by members of both aristocracies, established patterns that would define the Immortals. These weren't purely Persian units, but pan-Iranian forces that transcended tribal identity in service to empire. The conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE represented the ultimate test. Nebuchadnezzar's city stood protected by walls so massive that chariots could race along their tops. Its defenders included veterans of campaigns across Mesopotamia. Yet Cyrus's forces entered almost without resistance, thanks to intelligence networks, internal collaboration, and the psychological impact of facing an army that had never known defeat. The Babylonian campaign demonstrated that elite troops served functions beyond combat. They gathered intelligence, conducted diplomacy, and projected invincibility. Cultural elements shaped these proto-immortals as much as military necessity. Persian religious traditions, particularly Zoroastrian concepts of eternal struggle between order and chaos, reinforced ideas of disciplined service to legitimate authority. The king wasn't merely a political leader, but a cosmic force, maintaining civilization against barbarism. Serving him meant participating in a sacred duty, not just collecting pay. Median martial traditions, emphasizing cavalry skill and aristocratic honor, merged with Persian infantry tactics to create something hybrid and deadly. The Persian concept of arta, truth, order, righteousness, became central to military culture. Warriors weren't simply fighters, but defenders of cosmic order. Their discipline reflected universal harmony. Their loyalty demonstrated moral truth. This ideological framework transformed military service from mercenary contract to spiritual calling, binding soldiers through belief as much as gold. By the time of Cyrus's death in 530 BCE, fighting against the Massagetæ in Central Asia, the foundations existed for what would become the Immortal Guard, a corps of professional soldiers drawn from Persian and Median nobility, trained to identical standards, equipped uniformly, and bound by ideology and self-interest to the Achaemenid throne. They had proven themselves in every major campaign, absorbed the military wisdom of conquered peoples, and developed tactical flexibility that made them effective anywhere from Anatolian mountains to Mesopotamian plains. Yet they remained incomplete. The true crystallization of the Immortals, their fixed number, their replacement system, their legendary reputation, required one more element. They needed a king who understood not just military power, but the theater of empire, the propaganda of invincibility, the careful cultivation of myth. That king was coming. His name would be Darius, and under his rule, the elite guard would transform from practical necessity into eternal legend. But first, they would need to survive the chaos of succession, where loyalty meant everything and betrayal lurked behind every smile. The empire's elite were about to face their greatest test, not from foreign enemies, but from the throne they had sworn to protect. The Immortals weren't a single homogeneous mass, but a carefully stratified hierarchy reflecting Persian society's aristocratic nature. At the apex stood the Hazarapati, the commander of 10,000, typically a member of one of the 7 great Persian noble families who had supported Darius's ascension to power. Below him operated unit commanders responsible for thousands, then hundreds, then tens, each rank distinguished by subtle variations in equipment and privilege. Veterans who had survived multiple campaigns occupied positions of respect, their experience invaluable for training newer members and maintaining institutional knowledge across generations. Young recruits entered at the bottom, sons of Persian and Median nobility who had completed their basic education in the traditional aristocratic curriculum, riding, archery, and speaking truth. These youths faced years of proving themselves before earning full status as immortals. They learned not just from formal instruction, but from observation and emulation, watching how veterans moved, fought, and carried themselves. The hierarchy wasn't merely administrative, but pedagogical, designed to transmit martial culture across generations without losing effectiveness. Aristocratic influence permeated every aspect of the Guard's composition. Noble families competed fiercely for positions within the Immortals, understanding that placement meant proximity to power. A son serving in the royal guard could advance his family's interests, gather intelligence, forge alliances, and position himself for greater responsibilities. The great king maintained ultimate authority over appointments, but he couldn't ignore the delicate balance of noble factions. Favoring one family too obviously risked alienating others. The result was constant political maneuvering where military competence intersected with bloodline, wealth, and court influence. Daily training routines began before dawn and continued throughout the day with relentless intensity. Physical conditioning formed the foundation, running in full equipment, wrestling matches that built strength and combat instincts, swimming to develop endurance. Persian military tradition emphasized all-around physical excellence rather than specialization. An immortal needed the stamina for forced marches across desert terrain, the strength to hold formation during prolonged engagements, and the agility to respond instantly to changing battlefield conditions. Archery training consumed hours each day. Persians had elevated bowmanship to an art form, and Immortals were expected to master it completely. They practiced at various ranges, from targets 50 paces distant to volleys aimed at massed formations 200 paces away. They learned to shoot from horseback, although primarily infantry, because versatility defined Persian military philosophy. They practiced in wind, rain, heat, and cold, understanding that battles happened regardless of weather. The emphasis was on volume and accuracy. An Immortal should release arrows rapidly while maintaining lethal precision. Spear work required equal dedication. The standard Persian spear measured approximately 8 feet in length, tipped with iron and weighted at the butt with a distinctive spike. This spike served multiple purposes. It could be planted in the ground to create defensive hedgehog formations, used as a secondary weapon if the spear broke, and indicated rank through its material. Common Immortals carried silver spikes, while officers bore gold, a visible reminder of hierarchy even in battle. Training emphasized thrusting techniques, formation cohesion, and the coordination necessary to present an unbroken wall of spear points to charging enemies. The Achaemenid, the distinctive Persian shortsword, served as the Immortals' personal weapon of last resort and constant companion. Unlike the longer Greek Xerxes, the Achaemenid measured only 14 to 18 inches, designed for close-quarters stabbing rather than slashing. Every Immortal wore one on his right hip, suspended from an elaborate belt that itself signified status. Training with the Achaemenid focused on rapid draws, precise thrusts, targeting gaps in armor, and fighting in the crushing press of melee, where longer weapons became liabilities. Shields completed the Immortals' defensive equipment, large wicker constructions covered in leather and decorated with elaborate Persian motifs. These shields were lighter than Greek bronze-faced hoplon shields, but provided comparable protection while allowing greater mobility. The decorations weren't merely aesthetic, but identified units and reinforced cultural identity. A soldier carried not just his personal protection, but a symbol of Persian civilization itself. Discipline distinguished the Immortals from conscript armies and tribal levies. They drilled constantly in synchronized movements, advancing in perfect lines, wheeling as unified blocks, transitioning from archery to spear combat without breaking formation. Greek observers, accustomed to the organized but limited tactical flexibility of hoplite phalanxes, marveled at Persian precision. The Immortals could execute complex maneuvers that required every man to know his position and responsibility instinctively. This discipline emerged from endless repetition, harsh punishment for failures, and pride in belonging to an elite institution. The requirement to maintain exactly 10,000 soldiers became the Immortals' defining characteristic and the source of their legendary name. When an Immortal died, fell sick, or became incapacitated, his replacement arrived immediately, sometimes before the casualty had even left the ranks. This system required maintaining a pool of qualified candidates, always ready for promotion, creating intense competition among younger soldiers and veterans in auxiliary units. The psychological impact was profound. Enemies facing the Immortals knew that casualties meant nothing, that the formation never weakened, that the unit they fought at dawn would be equally strong at dusk. Personal wealth determined an Immortal's appearance, and to some degree, his effectiveness. Unlike modern militaries with centralized supply systems, Persian soldiers provided their own equipment. The empire set standards for weapons and armor, but individuals purchased or commissioned them personally. This meant that wealthier Immortals wore superior armor, scale mail of bronze or even iron, elaborately decorated helmets, expensive dyed clothing. Poorer members, though still from noble families, wore simpler versions of the same equipment. The system reinforced social hierarchies while ensuring that every Immortal had personal investment in maintaining his gear. The Immortals' privileges extended far beyond the battlefield. They received superior rations, wheat bread when common soldiers ate barley, meat regularly rather than occasionally, wine instead of water. Their quarters, whether in permanent garrisons or campaign camps, reflected their status. While regular troops slept in open fields or crowded tents, immortals enjoyed structured accommodations with proper bedding and personal space. These weren't luxuries, but calculated investments in maintaining fighting effectiveness and loyalty. Social status separated immortals from the general population as dramatically as palace walls divided kings from subjects. An immortal walked through Persepolis or Susa with visible authority. Merchants offered better prices, hopeful fathers presented daughters for marriage, governors sought their opinions, service in the guard opened doors to administrative positions, provincial governorships, and wealth accumulation impossible for common citizens. This status became self-reinforcing. The best families sent their sons to the immortals. The immortals received the best opportunities. Those opportunities elevated families further. Yet this elite status contained a dangerous contradiction. The same privileges that motivated loyalty also bred complacency. The same aristocratic connections that ensured quality recruits also introduced factional politics into military affairs. The same wealth that provided excellent equipment also tempted corruption, and the same proximity to royal power that made immortals valuable also made them dangerous. Because serving the king meant more than protecting his life. It meant witnessing his weaknesses, knowing his secrets, and possessing the means to end his reign. The immortals were simultaneously the throne's greatest security and its most intimate threat. And in the palace intrigues that defined Persian court life, that dual nature would be tested repeatedly, often with bloody consequences. The question wasn't whether the immortals would remain loyal. It was which faction would claim their loyalty when the empire's great families went to war against each other. The immortals' battlefield role began with dense formations of spear and shield, creating what Persian commanders called the wall of points. Unlike the rigid Greek phalanx that required level ground and limited maneuverability, Persian formations emphasized adaptability while maintaining defensive strength. The front ranks locked their large wicker shields together, overlapping edges to create a continuous barrier while leveling their 8-foot spears at chest height. Behind them, successive ranks held spears at varying angles, creating multiple layers of threat that made penetrating the formation nearly impossible without sustaining catastrophic casualties. This shield wall served multiple purposes beyond simple defense. It protected the archers positioned in rear ranks, provided a stable anchor for the entire Persian battle line, and created psychological pressure on enemies who faced what appeared to be an impenetrable barrier. The immortals drilled endlessly in maintaining formation cohesion while advancing, withdrawing, or wheeling to face threats from new directions. Each soldier understood his exact position relative to his neighbors, knowing that gaps meant death for himself and his comrades. The coordination between these spear formations and Persian archery represented military innovation that few ancient armies could match. As battle commenced, the immortals' archers launched volleys from behind the shield wall, raining arrows on enemy formations at distances up to 200 yards. This wasn't random shooting, but calculated saturation fire designed to disrupt enemy cohesion, wound unarmored soldiers, and force opponents to advance with shields raised, slowing their approach and exhausting them before contact. When enemies closed to melee range, Persian archers could continue shooting over the heads of their own front ranks or slip through gaps to deliver arrows at point-blank range before retreating behind the spear wall. This flexibility, transitioning seamlessly between ranged and close combat roles, gave the immortals tactical options that purely heavy infantry formations lacked. Greek hoplites, superb in direct collision, found themselves weathering arrow storms they couldn't answer, their bronze armor offering imperfect protection against the barbed shafts that found gaps at joints and necks. Cavalry coordination elevated Persian tactics beyond anything contemporary infantry armies achieved. Light Persian cavalry mounted on swift horses and armed with composite bows, worked in concert with the Immortals to execute devastating combined arms attacks. As the infantry fixed enemy attention with their advancing wall, cavalry swept around flanks to strike from unexpected angles. The timing required split-second precision. Cavalry arriving too early faced isolated destruction. Too late missed the opportunity to exploit enemy confusion. Heavy cavalry, including the elite cataphracts in their scale armor, delivered shock charges aimed at breaking enemy formations, already weakened by archery and engaged with infantry. The Immortals trained to open controlled gaps in their own lines, allowing friendly cavalry to charge through, then immediately closing ranks to prevent enemy exploitation. This maneuver required extraordinary discipline and trust, as even momentary hesitation could transform a tactical opportunity into disaster. The replacement system that gave the Immortals their legendary name functioned smoothly even during active campaigns. Wounded or killed soldiers were immediately pulled from the line, their positions filled by reserves who had marched directly behind the formation. This rotation happened so seamlessly that enemy forces often couldn't detect when the Persian line had suffered casualties. The psychological impact was devastating. Opponents who believed they were making progress suddenly realized the enemy remained at full strength. This system also allowed the Immortals to fight longer than comparable units. While Greek hoplites or Egyptian infantry grew progressively weaker as casualties mounted and exhaustion set in, the Immortals maintained consistent combat effectiveness by cycling fresh soldiers into the line. The unit as a whole never weakened, never faltered, never broke, because it was constantly being renewed from within. Persian strategy emphasized attrition and sustained pressure rather than seeking single decisive engagements. The Immortals could maintain contact with enemy forces for days, never allowing them to rest, regroup, or receive reinforcements. Their superior logistics, supply trains, established depots along invasion routes, foraging systems that didn't depend on individual soldiers, meant they could operate in enemy territory far longer than opponents could sustain resistance. This grinding approach broke enemy morale as effectively as battlefield defeats. Mobility in long campaigns distinguished the Immortals from heavier infantry formations. They could march 25 miles per day in full equipment, establish fortified camps each night, and remain ready for battle at dawn. The royal road system that connected the Persian Empire provided predictable resupply points, allowing the Immortals to travel light while knowing provisions awaited. Greek city-states, dependent on citizen soldiers who needed to return home for harvests, couldn't match this operational endurance. The reputation for invincibility built through uniform appearance and flawless discipline became a weapon itself. When enemies first saw the Immortals approach, 10,000 men moving in perfect synchronization, armor glinting, spears leveled identically, not a single break in formation, they witnessed something beyond ordinary military force. They saw imperial power made manifest, an army that represented civilization's triumph over chaos. Many opponents lost battles psychologically before the first arrow flew, their confidence shattered by confronting what seemed a supernatural force. The conquest of Egypt under Cambyses II in 525 BCE demonstrated the Immortals' effectiveness against one of antiquity's premier military powers. Egyptian forces, veterans of centuries of warfare and defenders of fortified positions along the Nile, fell before coordinated Persian assaults that combined archery, infantry pressure, and cavalry exploitation. The Immortals' discipline in the desert climate, their ability to maintain formation in sandstorms, and their systematic reduction of Egyptian strongpoints showcased tactical flexibility beyond pure combat skill. The invasion of Scythia under Darius I in 513 BCE tested the Immortals against an entirely different enemy, nomadic horse archers who refused direct battle. The Scythians employed scorched earth tactics, withdrawing before Persian advances while harassing supply lines. Though the campaign ultimately proved frustrating and inconclusive, the Immortals demonstrated their ability to operate in hostile territory against unconventional enemies, maintaining cohesion through months of pursuit across the steppes. The confrontation with Greek forces revealed both the Immortals' strengths and the limitations of Persian tactical doctrine. At Marathon in 490 BCE, Persian forces, including elements of the Immortals, faced Athenian hoplites on the narrow coastal plain. The Greeks' heavier armor and deeper formation proved decisive in the direct collision, their bronze-armored infantry crashing through Persian lines before the Immortals could effectively employ their archery and mobility advantages. 6,400 Persian dead testified to the cost of fighting on terrain that negated Persian tactical flexibility. Thermopylae in 480 BCE offered different lessons. The narrow pass eliminated Persian numerical superiority and cavalry options, forcing the Immortals into brutal frontal assaults against Spartan defenders who had chosen terrain perfectly. For 2 days, the Immortals hurled themselves against the Greek position, suffering horrific casualties as their lighter armor and shorter spears met Spartan heavy infantry in confined space. Only Betrayal, a Greek guide revealing a mountain path, broke the stalemate, allowing the Persians to outflank and destroy the defenders. Yet Plataea in 479 BCE saw the Immortals and Persian forces face devastating defeat. Greek hoplites, particularly the Spartans, broke through to kill the Persian commander Mardonius. His death shattered Persian cohesion, and what began as tactical withdrawal became panicked rout. 40,000 escaped, but the rest were trapped and slaughtered, a stark demonstration that invincibility was reputation, not reality. These battles taught the Greek world that Persian forces, including the legendary Immortals, could be defeated through superior armor, appropriate terrain selection, and disciplined resistance to psychological pressure. The myth of the unconquerable Persian began to crack, revealing underneath professional soldiers whose tactics worked brilliantly in open terrain with cavalry support, but struggled against specialized heavy infantry in constrained spaces. Still, the Immortals remained formidable for decades, adapting their tactics based on lessons learned. They represented the cutting edge of ancient military science, combined arms coordination, sustained operational capability, and institutional knowledge preserved across generations. Their battles shaped how empires thought about warfare, demonstrating that victory required more than courage or numbers. It demanded system, discipline, and the ability to integrate multiple combat arms into seamless cooperation. But as the Immortals proved their worth on distant battlefields, another role waited at home, one far more dangerous than any foreign enemy. Because the greatest threats to Persian kings rarely came from outside the empire. They came from within the palace walls, from ambitious nobles with access to royal chambers and the loyalty of 10,000 elite soldiers sworn to protect the throne or to seize it. The Immortals' most sacred duty was not on distant battlefields, but at the very heart of the empire. They were the immediate guardians of the great king and his family. Close contingents of the guard surrounded the monarch at all times, forming a living wall between the Achaemenid ruler and any potential threat, whether in the throne room, on the road, or in the chaos of war. Their presence made a clear statement to courtiers and foreign envoys alike. Access to the king was controlled by men whose loyalty, training, and status placed them above ordinary soldiers and administrators. Daily life at court revolved around ceremonies where every position was choreographed, and the Immortals occupied the closest and most honored military roles. During royal audiences, select members stood in fixed positions beside the throne, along processional routes, and at major gateways of palaces in Persepolis, Susa, or Pasargadae. Their vigilance was both practical and symbolic. They watched for danger, but they also represented the order and majesty of the empire, their uniforms, weapons, and posture, turning the king's presence into a carefully staged piece of imperial theater. Court ritual demanded that nothing around the great king appear accidental. The Immortals controlled who advanced, who waited, and who knelt. Their spears and bows were as much instruments of protocol as of war. During religious festivals, enthronement ceremonies, or grand banquets, they moved according to established patterns, opening ranks for the monarch's passage, closing around him when he rose, and lining staircases and halls in rigid symmetry. To foreign emissaries unused to such choreography, the effect was overwhelming. Power here was not improvisational, but meticulously organized, with the guard as its visible, disciplined edge. Proximity to the king turned military service into a direct pathway to political influence. An immortal officer who guarded the royal bedchamber or escorted the monarch on hunts, heard conversations, saw private gestures, and understood subtleties that distant satraps or generals could only guess at. This access generated immense prestige, but it also ignited rivalry. Families across the empire vied to place their sons in positions closest to the king, hoping that a single trusted word at the right moment might tip a decision about appointments, taxes, or campaigns. Inside the palaces, the guards' responsibilities extended beyond pure security into administration. Senior officers handled internal communications, managed rosters, supervised storerooms tied to military supply, and coordinated with scribes who recorded stipends, privileges, and punishments. Some immortals served as messengers for highly sensitive orders, carrying sealed directives only they were trusted to deliver. Others oversaw the movement of prisoners of high status, ensuring that valuable captives remained controlled yet unharmed until the king decided their fate. The same skills that made them effective battlefield leaders, discipline, literacy, logistical awareness, qualified immortals for semi-bureaucratic tasks at court. A trusted captain might be temporarily assigned to monitor palace guards drawn from other units, ensuring no regional faction controlled too much of the internal security apparatus. Another might supervise the training schedules of garrison troops in the capital region, maintaining readiness in case of unrest. In effect, the guard became the hinge where military force, palace protocol, and central administration met. Beyond palace walls, immortals served as escorts for diplomatic missions and tribute caravans moving through the empire. When a subject king, Greek envoy, or Eastern prince traveled to an Achaemenid court, detachments of the guard accompanied them, both to protect and to intimidate. Their immaculate equipment and flawless marching underscored the message that the Persian king commanded not just wealth, but disciplined, ever-present force. Likewise, caravans carrying gold, textiles, rare animals, or exotic goods to the royal treasuries often moved under immortal protection, a visible reminder that tribute flowing toward the center of the empire was under the direct watch of the king's closest soldiers. These external missions also allowed immortal officers to gather intelligence. While accompanying embassies or tribute delegations, they observed local power structures, troop quality, fortifications, and popular sentiment. Reports they brought back, formally or informally, could shape royal policy toward a satrap, a vassal ruler, or a border people. Thus the guard functioned as an extension of the king's eyes and ears, a network of observant professionals, constantly shuttling between center and periphery. But wherever power concentrated, conspiracies followed. The Immortals stood at the intersection of rival ambitions, those of hereditary nobility, ambitious generals, eunuchs who controlled inner chambers, and even royal kin who saw in any succession crisis an opening for advancement. Some of the most dangerous plots in Achaemenid history required at least the neutrality, if not the active cooperation, of elements within the guard. A coup without control of the king's immediate protectors was nearly impossible. A plot with their participation became terrifyingly feasible. After the death of Cambyses II, the so-called false Smerdis episode highlighted how closely the guard's actions affected imperial stability. When a pretender took the throne by impersonating the king's brother, elite troops around the palace initially followed protocol and obeyed royal orders, demonstrating that their first instinct was to protect whoever occupied the throne. Only when a coalition of nobles, including Darius, persuaded key officers that the man they protected was an impostor did parts of the security apparatus turn. The resulting palace coup, executed with speed and precision, depended on intimate knowledge of palace layout, guard rotations, and who controlled which door at which moment. That success elevated Darius, but it also set a precedent. The Immortals could be kingmakers as well as king protectors. Rival noble houses realized this and began courting influential officers with gifts, marriages, and promises of future promotion. Eunuchs, who managed internal palace spaces, communication with royal women, and many practical aspects of daily life, sometimes clashed with immortal commanders over access and information. Generals commanding field armies resented that palace-based officers, who might see little true combat in a given year, still held the king's ear and controlled physical access to him. Tensions between these groups could escalate quickly. A report from a jealous general might accuse an immortal officer of corruption or disloyalty. A eunuch, fearing loss of influence, might spread rumors about the guard's arrogance or desire to rule through the spear. In turn, immortal captains sometimes complained that court officials interfered in security matters they didn't understand, weakening defenses out of vanity or ignorance. The king stood above these quarrels in theory, but in practice, whoever most effectively shaped his perception could tilt the balance decisively. Recorded cases of internal betrayal often involve some combination of royal kin, nobles, and elite soldiers. In later Achaemenid history, assassinations and forced abdications repeatedly unfolded inside palaces, supposedly guarded by the most loyal troops in the empire. Sometimes the guards split, one faction remaining faithful to the reigning monarch, while another backed a claimant they believed stronger, more legitimate, or more likely to reward them. At other times, immortal officers looked the other way, while conspirators slipped through forbidden doors, reasoning that survival and future favor mattered more than abstract loyalty to a doomed king. Yet such betrayals never fully erased the image of the guard as protectors of royal authority. Each new king tried to bind them more tightly to his person, through increased stipends, public honors, and participation in high ceremonies. Reliefs at Persepolis show elaborately dressed guards standing in ordered ranks behind the monarch, frozen for eternity in poses of perfect devotion. These images projected the ideal, a king encircled by incorruptible warriors, immune to the uncertainties of human ambition. Reality, however, remained more complicated because those same warriors lived, loved, feared, and calculated like everyone else. For the immortals themselves, the palace was both pinnacle and trap. Service near the king offered the greatest conceivable honor and the most dangerous entanglements. A single misjudged alliance, a wrong word in a corridor, or a perceived hesitation during a succession struggle could end a career or a life. Officers learned to read not only military maps, but also expressions, silences, and the shifting temperature of court factions. The art of survival required them to be half soldier, half politician, always vigilant not just against assassins, but against rumors and shifting loyalties. Some succeeded brilliantly, rising from palace protectors to provincial governors or supreme commanders. Others miscalculated, backing a prince who fell out of favor or a satrap who misread the king's patience. When purges came, immortal officers could find themselves stripped of command, exiled or executed as examples to others. In such moments, the glittering palaces of Persepolis and Susa revealed a harsher truth. The closer one stood to the center of power, the more fatal a single mistake could become. And behind every ceremony, every guarded door, every carefully arranged formation around the throne, one question haunted the guard. When the next crisis came, when rival princes marched, satraps rebelled, or the king himself faltered, on which side would 10,000 protectors choose to stand? Soon the empire would enter a period where that choice would no longer be theoretical. The same soldiers who guarded the great king's life would discover what it meant when the very institution they embodied began to crack from within. The Immortals reached their apex under Darius I and his son Xerxes I, transforming from an elite military unit into a symbol of imperial might that defined the Achaemenid Empire's golden age. Darius, who seized power in 522 BCE through a conspiracy involving key members of the Guard, understood better than any predecessor how to harness the Immortals' dual nature as both practical force and propaganda instrument. Under his reign, the Guard expanded its role from simple protection to embodying the Empire's reach, discipline, and invincibility across 3 continents. Darius deployed the Immortals in campaigns that secured Egypt, pushed into Scythian territories beyond the Danube, and established Persian dominance over the eastern Mediterranean. Each expedition demonstrated not just military capability, but organizational genius, the ability to project force thousands of miles from the heartland while maintaining supply lines, communication networks, and political control. The Immortals marched through deserts, mountains, and river valleys, adapting to every terrain while never losing their distinctive cohesion and appearance. When Darius invaded Greece in 490 BCE, elements of the Immortals likely participated in the Marathon campaign, though Greek sources focus more on Persian numbers than specific units. The defeat at Marathon stung Persian pride, but it didn't diminish the Guard's reputation within the empire itself. To subject peoples from India to Libya, the Immortals remained the ultimate expression of the great king's power. Soldiers who had never been truly defeated in the empire's core territories and who symbolized the permanence of Achaemenid rule. Xerxes I inherited this perfected instrument when he ascended the throne in 486 BCE. His massive invasion of Greece in 480 BCE showcased the Immortals at the height of their fame. At Thermopylae, they faced the Spartan king Leonidas and 300 warriors in the narrow pass that neutralized Persian numerical superiority. For 2 days, the Immortals assaulted the Greek position, suffering casualties that would have broken lesser units. Their willingness to continue attacking despite horrific losses demonstrated the discipline and morale that defined them. They fought not from desperation, but from professional pride and absolute confidence in their system. The glory of the Immortals manifested most visibly in their appearance during this golden age. Their uniforms became increasingly elaborate, combining military functionality with imperial pageantry. Scale armor of bronze or iron protected torsos, while robes of expensive dyed cloth, purples, crimsons, and deep blues marked their status. Gold and silver ornaments adorned their weapons, particularly the distinctive pomegranate or apple counterweights on their spears that gave them the alternate name apple bearers. These decorations weren't frivolous, but deliberately cultivated symbols of Persian wealth and refinement, designed to awe allies and intimidate enemies. The monumental sculptures at Persepolis immortalized the Immortals in stone, creating images that would outlast the empire itself. The Apadana staircases feature detailed reliefs showing guards in perfect formation, their equipment and postures carved with extraordinary precision. These weren't generic soldiers, but representations of specific units, including the Immortals, frozen in eternal vigilance around the symbolic royal presence. Greek artists, employed by Persian rulers, brought their technical mastery to these works, creating hybrid art that merged Persian imperial ideology with Hellenic aesthetic sophistication. The reliefs served multiple purposes beyond mere decoration. They communicated to visitors from across the empire, satraps, tribute-bearers, foreign ambassadors, that Persian power rested on organized force, that the king commanded soldiers of unmatched quality, and that resistance was futile against such disciplined might. The image of the Immortals standing in perfect ranks, weapons identical, postures synchronized, became synonymous with the empire itself, vast, ordered, and eternal. Cultural diffusion followed the Immortals wherever they campaigned. Persian military customs, equipment designs, and tactical concepts spread through conquered territories and influenced neighboring peoples. Greek city-states, despite their fierce independence, adopted elements of Persian organization. Egyptian garrison commanders studied Persian logistics. Eastern peoples incorporated Persian cavalry tactics. The Immortals became templates for other rulers attempting to create professional standing armies. Their model copied imperfectly but extensively. The myth of invincibility that surrounded the Guard during this period transcended simple military reputation. It became psychological warfare of the highest order, a weapon deployed before the first arrow flew. The replacement system that maintained their constant 10,000 strength created the impression of supernatural regeneration. An army that couldn't be depleted, couldn't be weakened, couldn't be defeated through attrition. Enemies facing them understood intellectually that Immortals died like any soldiers, but emotionally, psychologically, they confronted something that seemed beyond mortality. This psychological impact manifested in numerous ways. Cities sometimes surrendered at the approach of Persian forces, known to include Immortals, calculating that resistance was pointless. Tribal confederations fragmented when faced with soldiers whose discipline and coordination made their own warrior traditions seem primitive. Even Greek polis, fiercely proud of their hoplite traditions, recognized that Persian organization represented a different order of military capability, not necessarily superior in every tactical situation, but formidable in its consistency and professionalism. The economic dimension of conquest strengthened the Guard materially during this golden age. Tribute flowing from Egypt, Anatolia, the Levant, and the eastern satrapies funded expanded training facilities, better equipment, and increased stipends. The wealth of empire meant that Immortals could afford superior armor, finer weapons, and luxuries that elevated their living standards far above common soldiers. This economic investment created a positive feedback loop. The Guard's effectiveness secured tribute. Tribute enhanced the Guard's capabilities. Enhanced capabilities secured more territory and wealth. Royal treasuries allocated substantial resources specifically to maintaining the Immortals' appearance and readiness. When Xerxes assembled his massive invasion force for Greece, contemporary observers noted that the Immortals stood out even among hundreds of thousands of soldiers for the richness of their equipment and the precision of their movements. This wasn't accidental, but represented deliberate investment in creating a showcase unit that embodied imperial prestige as much as combat effectiveness. The presence of Immortals at diplomatic ceremonies, religious festivals, and royal processions became theatre designed to overwhelm foreign observers. Embassies arriving at Persepolis or Susa witnessed thousands of soldiers moving in absolute synchronization, their armor catching sunlight, their formations geometrically perfect. The message was clear and intentional. The Persian Empire commanded resources and organizational capacity beyond anything rival powers could match. The Immortals weren't just soldiers, but ambassadors of imperial ideology, living arguments for submission over resistance. During Xerxes' reign, the Guard participated in campaigns that stretched from Libya to the Hindu Kush, demonstrating operational range that no other ancient military force could replicate. Their ability to maintain effectiveness across such distances, fighting effectively in desert heat and mountain cold, in river crossings and siege operations, testified to training systems and logistical support that represented the peak of ancient military science. Yet even at this apex, subtle cracks appeared in the foundation. The defeat at Salamis in 480 BCE, followed by catastrophic losses at Plataea in 479 BCE, demonstrated that Persian military might, even when embodied by the legendary Immortals, could be overcome by determined, well-led opponents fighting on favorable terrain. The psychological aura of invincibility suffered its first serious damage not from battlefield casualties, which could be replaced, but from strategic defeat that exposed limitations in Persian tactical doctrine. The golden age of the Immortals represented a unique moment when military effectiveness, political stability, economic prosperity, and cultural confidence aligned perfectly. The Guard stood as perhaps the most famous military unit in the ancient world. their reputation spreading through Greek accounts, Persian records, and the oral traditions of dozens of conquered peoples. They were simultaneously reality and symbol, 10,000 actual soldiers performing real duties, and an idea of imperial power that transcended any individual warrior. But empires built on conquest and maintained through military supremacy face an inevitable challenge. What happens when the conquests end? When borders stabilize? When tribute becomes routine? When the need for disciplined professional soldiers diminishes in favor of courtly display and political manipulation? The Immortals had conquered an empire. The question facing them after Xerxes was whether they could survive the peace, and whether the same proximity to power that made them kingmakers would ultimately make them vulnerable to the palace intrigues that destroyed so many who stood too close to the throne. The seeds of decline were already present in the Golden Age's brilliance, waiting for the right conditions to sprout and strangle what once seemed eternal. The assassination of Xerxes I in 465 BCE marked the beginning of systemic instability that would never fully heal. His murder, orchestrated by the commander of the royal bodyguard Artabanus and carried out within the palace itself, revealed a horrifying truth. The Immortals had failed their primary mission, protecting the great king. Worse, elements within the guard apparatus had participated in the conspiracy, demonstrating that proximity to power had corrupted the institution meant to safeguard it. The succession that followed descended into chaos, with multiple claimants, palace murders, and competing noble factions all manipulating segments of the military for political advantage. Artaxerxes I eventually secured the throne, but only after eliminating rivals through violence that required careful navigation of guard loyalties. The precedent was devastating. The Immortals could be turned against the monarch they theoretically served, their swords pointing inward rather than defending the empire's borders. Each subsequent succession became a test of which faction controlled enough of the guard to impose their candidate. When Artaxerxes I died in 425 BCE, the ensuing struggle saw Xerxes II assassinated after merely 45 days, followed by brief rule under Sogdianus, before Darius II seized power. The Immortals, once symbols of imperial stability, became instruments of court intrigue. Noble families increasingly viewed positions within the guard not as military duties but as political investments. Ambitious aristocrats bribed commanders for appointments, placed relatives in key positions, and cultivated personal followings within units supposedly loyal only to the crown. The criteria for selection shifted subtly but decisively. Lineage and wealth began mattering more than combat skill or demonstrated loyalty. A young noble, whose family controlled vast estates and commanded networks of clients, could secure a place in the guard more easily than a proven veteran from a less prestigious background. The use of Immortals for internal intimidation became routine during this period. Kings deployed them to suppress rebellions in Egypt and Babylon, to cow restive satraps, and to demonstrate royal power during succession disputes. These missions differed fundamentally from foreign campaigns. Fighting fellow subjects in civil conflicts corroded the ideological framework that had sustained the guard's morale. Persians killing Persians, elite soldiers enforcing unpopular policies against populations who had once honored them. This internal violence bred cynicism that undermined discipline more effectively than any battlefield defeat. Prolonged peace in core territories, paradoxically, accelerated decline. The generations that had fought under Darius and Xerxes gradually aged out, taking with them institutional knowledge and combat experience. Their replacements knew the Immortals' reputation, but had never tested themselves in major campaigns. Training continued, but without the urgency that comes from anticipating actual combat. Drills became rituals, standards relaxed incrementally, and the gap widened between what the guard claimed to be and what it actually could accomplish. The replacement system that had maintained the symbolic 10,000 began functioning differently. Instead of drawing from a deep pool of qualified candidates competing for honor, positions increasingly went to whoever had connections or could pay. The immediate replacement of casualties, once a demonstration of depth and readiness, became bureaucratic theater. The number remained constant, but quality deteriorated as experienced soldiers retired or died without equivalent successors. The Guard became a shell maintaining its external form while hollowing from within. Corruption spread through the officer corps like disease. Commanders discovered that their positions offered opportunities for enrichment beyond official stipends. Control over equipment procurement, authority over garrison assignments, and access to funds meant for training and supplies all became revenue streams. Officers who should have spent their time drilling troops instead cultivated relationships with merchants, negotiated kickbacks on supply contracts, and extorted money from subordinates seeking favorable postings. The most successful weren't the best soldiers, but the cleverest operators of patronage networks. The purchase of positions became increasingly blatant. Families paid substantial sums to place sons in the Immortals, treating Guard service as a credential for future administrative careers rather than a military calling. These purchased positions went to young men who had never campaigned, some who had barely trained, individuals whose understanding of warfare came from palace ceremonies rather than battlefield experience. They wore the distinctive uniforms, carried the ornate weapons, and occupied slots that should have gone to qualified warriors. Merit eroded as the organizing principle of the Guard. Promotions depended less on combat effectiveness or leadership capability and more on political allegiances and family influence. Officers advanced by supporting the right faction during succession disputes, not by winning battles. The most capable soldiers, seeing mediocrities promoted over them because of connections, grew disillusioned. Some left for service elsewhere, others simply stopped caring, performing minimum duties while pursuing their own interests. The Persian military establishment failed catastrophically to implement needed reforms, even as enemies modernized. Greek city-states learned from their conflicts with Persia, developing improved equipment, refined tactics, and more professional training systems. The rise of Macedonia under Philip II created a military machine that combined Greek heavy infantry with revolutionary cavalry tactics and siege warfare capabilities. Theban innovations in tactical depth and unit coordination spread through the Greek world. Yet Persian military doctrine remained essentially unchanged from the era of Darius the Fair. The Immortals' tactical limitations, exposed at Marathon and Plataea, were never seriously addressed. Their lighter armor still left them vulnerable to heavily armored opponents in close combat. Their tactical flexibility, once an advantage, became meaningless when facing enemies who had learned to counter Persian combined arms approaches. The reliance on numerical superiority and the replacement system couldn't compensate for fundamental equipment and tactical disadvantages against enemies who had studied Persian methods for decades and developed specific counters. Training standards declined without anyone officially acknowledging the deterioration. The demanding physical conditioning that had defined earlier generations relaxed. Archery practice became less frequent, spear drills more perfunctory, formation exercises simplified. Commanders focused on political positioning and financial gain didn't enforce standards rigorously. The culture of excellence that veterans had transmitted across generations broke down as fewer veterans remained to model proper standards and hold younger soldiers accountable. The economic foundations that had once strengthened the Guard began working against it. As administrative corruption increased empire-wide, funds supposedly allocated for military purposes disappeared into private pockets. Equipment quality declined as procurement officers accepted inferior goods in exchange for bribes. The food and accommodations that had elevated Immortals above regular troops eroded toward mediocrity. The material advantages that had attracted quality recruits diminished, while the institution's prestige sustained more by past reputation than present capability. temporarily masked the decline. Regional rebellions increasingly succeeded against forces that included immortal contingents. Egypt threw off Persian control repeatedly during the 4th century BCE, inflicting defeats on expeditions that would have been unthinkable under earlier dynasties. Greek mercenaries, hired by Persian kings who no longer trusted their own troops fully, proved more reliable than native Persian forces whose loyalty remained questionable. The empire increasingly depended on foreign soldiers, while its own legendary elite force became primarily a palace ornament. The strategic defeats that followed revealed how thoroughly the institution had degraded. When Artaxerxes III reconquered Egypt in 343 BCE, success came primarily through Greek mercenaries under Greek commanders, not through the Immortals' battlefield prowess. The Guard participated, but as one element among many, rather than as the decisive force they had once been. Their presence mattered more for intimidation and ceremony than for combat effectiveness, a reversal of priorities that would have horrified the unit's founders. The Guard that Darius III inherited when he took the throne in 336 BCE bore only superficial resemblance to the force that had terrorized 3 continents under his namesake. The numbers remained, the distinctive appearance persisted, the ceremonies continued unchanged. But the substance, the discipline, skill, morale, and effectiveness that had made the Immortals genuinely formidable, had eroded beyond recovery. Decades of political manipulation, corruption, declining standards, and failure to reform had transformed the empire's elite force into an expensive anachronism. And approaching from the northwest came a military genius who had studied Persian weaknesses obsessively, who commanded troops trained to exploit exactly the tactical vulnerabilities the Immortals had never addressed, who moved with a speed and aggression that Persian strategic doctrine couldn't counter. Alexander of Macedon was coming, and the Immortals he would face were shadows of their former selves. The question wasn't whether they would fight bravely. Personal courage had never been the issue. The question was whether an institution hollowed by decades of decline could somehow resurrect itself when confronting the greatest military challenge in its history. The empire's survival depended on the answer, and time had run out for preparation. The Immortals were about to face their final test, and neither they nor the empire they served were ready for what was coming. After the Achaemenid collapse, the Immortals survived not as soldiers, but as stories passed through generations across the former empire. Persian families who had served in the Guard transmitted memories to their descendants, tales of discipline, honor, and the empire's glory, days when their ancestors stood beside the great king. These oral traditions preserved details that written sources omitted: training rituals, unit songs, the weight of equipment, the pride of belonging to something greater than oneself. Even as political structures disintegrated under Macedonian and later Seleucid rule, the cultural memory of the Immortals persisted in communities that remembered when Persian power dominated the known world. The physical representations carved into Persepolis and other imperial sites ensured the Immortals would never be completely forgotten. The Apadana reliefs, showing rows of guards in perfect formation with their distinctive spears and robes, survived conquest and weathering to become archaeological treasures. When later civilizations rediscovered these ruins, the images spoke across centuries. Here were soldiers who had embodied an empire's might, their likenesses preserved in stone long after their flesh had turned to dust. These reliefs became primary sources for reconstructing the Guard's appearance and organization, allowing historians to move beyond literary accounts toward visual evidence. Greek reinvention of the Immortals began almost immediately after contact. Herodotus, writing in the mid-5th century BCE, gave them their enduring name, Immortals, based on the replacement system that maintained constant 10,000 strength. His account emphasized their exotic appearance, their discipline, and their seeming invincibility, creating a narrative that served Greek purposes. These were formidable opponents whose defeat proved Greek superiority. Later, Greek historians elaborated on this foundation, sometimes exaggerating Persian wealth and luxury to contrast with Greek austerity, other times emphasizing Persian organization to explain why such a mighty empire fell to smaller but more virtuous forces. The Greek interpretation transformed the Immortals from a specific military unit into a symbol of Oriental despotism and imperial power. Disciplined but servile, magnificent but ultimately inferior to free Greek warriors. This version spread through the Hellenistic world as Greek culture dominated post-conquest territories. The eternal army of 10,000 became a standard reference point in military discussions, though details grew increasingly distorted as decades passed, without anyone consulting Persian sources or perspectives. Roman writers inherited the Greek tradition and added their own interpretations. To Romans building their own empire, the Immortals represented both warning and inspiration, a professional standing force that had enabled Persian expansion but ultimately proved inadequate against determined resistance. Roman military theorists studied Persian organization while dismissing Persian tactical doctrine, extracting lessons about logistics, unit cohesion, and the value of elite formations, while maintaining that Roman discipline and citizenship created superior soldiers. The Praetorian Guard, though serving different functions, echoed some immortal characteristics: elite status, proximity to imperial power, and dangerous potential as political actors. Arab and Islamic historians encountered the Immortals through both Greek sources and surviving Persian traditions. The Sasanian Empire, which ruled Persia from 224 to 651 CE, consciously modeled some of its elite units on Achaemenid precedents, attempting to revive ancient glory through military institutions that echoed the Immortals. When Islamic conquests absorbed these territories, the memory of the Guard persisted in literature and folklore, sometimes merged with legendary elements from pre-Islamic Persian epics. The Immortals became figures in a grander narrative of Persian civilization, representatives of an era when Persian power extended from the Mediterranean to India. Modern resurrection of the Immortals began in the 19th century as European scholars rediscovered ancient Persia through archaeology and classical texts. The decipherment of cuneiform scripts, excavations at Persepolis and Susa, and systematic study of Greek historians brought the Achaemenid Empire back into historical consciousness. The Immortals, with their dramatic name and fascinating organizational system, captured popular imagination. They appeared in histories, novels, and eventually films as emblems of ancient military excellence and exotic grandeur. In 20th century Iran, the Immortals became central to nationalist revival under the Pahlavi dynasty. Reza Shah, and later Mohammad Reza Shah, promoted a vision of Iranian identity rooted in pre-Islamic Persian greatness, deliberately emphasizing Achaemenid achievements to build modern national pride. The Immortals served perfectly as symbols of this agenda. They were authentically Persian, indisputably elite, and represented an era when Iran dominated rather than resisted foreign influence. Military units were named after them. Their images appeared in public art and education, and the Guard became shorthand for Persian martial excellence. This nationalist appropriation continued even after the 1979 Islamic Revolution, though with modifications. While the new regime initially emphasized Islamic identity over Persian nationalism, cultural producers eventually incorporated pre-Islamic Persian elements, including the Immortals, into their narratives. The Guard's image proved too powerful and popular to abandon completely, so it was recontextualized, presented as defenders of Iranian civilization rather than specifically monarchical or pre-Islamic symbols. This demonstrates the Immortals' remarkable flexibility as cultural capital, adaptable to vastly different political agendas. Contemporary comparisons between the Immortals and modern Special Forces units reveal both similarities and profound differences. Like Special Forces, The Immortals were elite, rigorously selected, and extensively trained beyond standard military requirements. They operated in multiple roles: conventional combat, palace security, and sensitive missions requiring trustworthy personnel. Their reputation created psychological effects that amplified their tactical impact, much as special forces' reputations today serve strategic purposes beyond actual operations. However, the comparison breaks down upon closer examination. Modern special forces emphasize small unit operations, unconventional warfare, and strategic-level missions requiring initiative and flexibility. The Immortals, despite their quality, functioned primarily as conventional heavy infantry and royal guards. Elite, certainly, but not special in the contemporary military sense. Their strength lay in discipline and organization rather than independent operation. Comparing them to special forces reflects modern assumptions more than historical reality, projecting contemporary categories onto ancient institutions that operated under different paradigms. The legend survived beyond the facts for multiple reasons, each reinforcing the others. First, the name itself, Immortals, possessed inherent memorability and mystique that ensured transmission across cultures and centuries. Second, the visual evidence from Persepolis provided concrete imagery that made the abstract concept tangible and real. Third, the Greek literary tradition preserved and amplified their story, embedding it in foundational Western historical texts. Fourth, the Immortals represented a successful case of institutional military organization that offered lessons to later empires attempting similar feats. The psychological appeal of the Immortals' story contributes significantly to its endurance. They embodied aspirations that transcend particular eras. The desire for perfect discipline, the dream of creating institutions that outlast individuals, the fantasy of invincibility through organization and will. Every empire that followed wondered if it could recreate such a force, adapted to its own circumstances. Every military theorist studied them for insights into elite force creation and maintenance. Every storyteller recognized their dramatic potential. Warriors whose ranks never diminished, serving an empire that spanned the known world. The gap between reality and legend ultimately matters less than the cultural work the legend performs. The historical Immortals were impressive professional soldiers who served their empire capably for 2 centuries before declining with the institutions that sustained them. The legendary Immortals transcend history to become archetypes, representatives of military excellence, imperial power, and the ultimate futility of earthly glory. Both versions are real in their respective domains, one in the archaeological and textual record, the other in human imagination and cultural memory. Modern media, films like 300, video games, novels, and countless documentaries continue reinventing the Immortals for new audiences. These portrayals often prioritize spectacle over accuracy, but they perform the crucial function of keeping the Immortals present in contemporary consciousness. Each generation rediscovers them and remakes them in its own image, finding new meanings in ancient stories. The Immortals persist because they serve as blank screens onto which successive eras project their anxieties about power, discipline, loyalty, and the rise and fall of civilizations. Yet for all the myth-making and reinvention, a core question remains unresolved. What truly made the Immortals unique among ancient military formations? Was it their replacement system, their proximity to royal power, their distinctive appearance, their tactical flexibility, or something more elusive, a combination of factors that can be catalogued but never fully replicated? The question matters because it determines what lessons, if any, modern military institutions can extract from studying them, and whether understanding those lessons requires looking at what made them successful or at what ultimately caused even the mighty Immortals to fade into history despite everything they represented. When news reached Darius III that a young Macedonian king had crossed the Hellespont with a relatively small army, the Persian court initially underestimated the threat. The empire had faced Greek expeditions before and survived them all. Preparations focused on assembling a massive force drawn from across the Achaemenid world. Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, and contingents from as far as India and Central Asia. The Immortals were summoned as the core of the royal army, expected to embody the disciplined center around which the diverse host would form. Yet beneath the surface, they were no longer the cutting edge of an adaptable war machine, but a prestigious unit facing an opponent who had reinvented warfare. The Macedonian phalanx that Alexander brought to Asia represented a new kind of infantry. Armed with the sarissa, a pike far longer than traditional spears, and drilled into deep, cohesive formations, these soldiers could project lethal force at distances Persian infantry had never confronted effectively. The Persians knew they would face these formations and attempted to adjust by increasing their own numbers, deploying archers, and relying on their traditional strengths: cavalry, missile fire, and sheer scale. But their preparations remained rooted in assumptions that Macedonian tactics would resemble older Greek methods. They had not anticipated the integration of phalanx, heavy cavalry, and aggressive maneuver into a single, coherent system. At Issus in 333 BCE, the Immortals marched with Darius III into a narrow coastal plain pinned between mountains and sea. The terrain, ironically, neutralized Persian numerical superiority and reduced opportunities for large-scale cavalry maneuvers, precisely the advantages the empire usually relied upon. The Immortals formed part of the infantry line near the king, tasked with protecting his person and holding the center while cavalry attempted to envelop the Macedonian flanks. Alexander, recognizing that the Persian center housed Darius and his elite guard, aimed the most powerful elements of his army directly at that point, rather than dispersing his strength across the line. Alexander's hammer and anvil approach unfolded with ruthless clarity. The Macedonian phalanx advanced steadily, sarissas overlapping to create an impenetrable hedge of spear points. This advancing anvil pinned Persian infantry, including the Immortals, in place, denying them freedom of movement and forcing them into a grinding frontal struggle where their shorter spears and lighter armor left them disadvantaged. While the Persians strained against this wall of pikes, the hammer descended. Alexander himself, leading the companion cavalry, charged in a concentrated wedge toward the gap developing near the Persian center. The Immortals tried to adapt within the chaos. Veterans among them understood that preserving the king's life mattered more than holding ground. They tightened formation around Darius, shields overlapping, spears angled forward in layered ranks. Archers within the guard unit and nearby contingents loosed volleys toward the advancing phalanx and cavalry. But the Macedonians advanced relentlessly, their discipline absorbing casualties without breaking cohesion. The Persian elite, once accustomed to unnerving enemies with precision and unity, now confronted an opponent whose own discipline and morale equaled or surpassed theirs, backed by innovations their training had never addressed. Structural disadvantages became painfully obvious as the fighting intensified. The Immortals' traditional mixed role, part archers, part spearmen, offered flexibility, but left them neither as heavily protected as true heavy infantry, nor as mobile as light troops. Against the sarissa wall, their shorter spears forced them to close into lethal range before striking, suffering casualties before they could even reach Macedonian front ranks. Their wicker and leather shields, adequate against arrows and lighter weapons, provided less protection against the thrust of long pikes driven by tightly packed infantry. In the confined space of Issus, they could not exploit maneuver or combined arms coordination effectively. Strategic errors compounded these tactical problems. Darius had allowed himself to be trapped on unfavorable terrain, with his army compressed and his lines disordered as they deployed hurriedly to face Alexander's unexpected approach. The sheer size of the Persian host created communication problems. Orders spread slowly, responses came too late, and coordination between wings and center broke down. The Immortals, instead of serving as a mobile reserve or flexible striking force, found themselves fixed in place as a defensive shield around the king, reduced from empire's spearhead to glorified bodyguard under impossible conditions. When Alexander's charge punched through toward the Persian center, the critical moment arrived. Companion cavalry and supporting infantry drove into the gap, threatening to encircle the royal position. The Immortals fought desperately, pivoting to meet the assault, some turning their spears to ward off horsemen, others attempting to hold the line against encroaching phalanx units. For a brief period, their training and courage created a bulwark of resistance around Darius, absorbing shock after shock. But once cracks appeared and Macedonian cavalry began to flank their position, the danger of total encirclement became clear. Faced with the prospect of capture or death, Darius chose to flee. His chariot turned from the field, then his escort followed, and finally the Immortals, torn between duty to protect the king and the instinct for survival, began to withdraw in disarray. The moment the great king abandoned the battlefield, Persian morale collapsed. What had been desperate resistance dissolved into panic. Units that had fought stubbornly now broke and ran, seeing the royal standard receding in the distance. The Immortals, whose presence once steadied entire armies, could not reverse the psychological shock of their monarch's flight. Issus did not destroy the guard outright, but it shattered their aura. They had failed to protect the king's honor, even if they preserved his life. They had been forced into retreat by a numerically smaller enemy. They had been outmaneuvered, outthought, and outfought in a battle whose memory would echo across the ancient world. Yet Persia still had resources, and Darius still commanded an empire stretching from Anatolia to Central Asia. A final reckoning loomed, and the Immortals would march again to stand between their king and the Macedonian storm. At Gaugamela in 331 BCE, Darius attempted to correct earlier mistakes. He chose an open plain, carefully prepared and leveled to allow maximum freedom for chariots and cavalry. This time, he intended to use his numeric advantage to envelop Alexander's smaller army. The Immortals took their place in the center once more, at the heart of a vast, meticulously arrayed host. On either wing, heavy and light cavalry waited to sweep around the enemy, while scythed chariots stood ready to tear gaps through Macedonian lines before the decisive assault. It looked on paper like the perfect stage for Persian strengths, yet Alexander adapted more quickly than Persian command structures could respond. He advanced obliquely, refusing a straightforward clash of centers and instead stretching the Persian line, drawing units out of position. His right wing edged forward, coaxing Persian cavalry into premature attacks, while his phalanx maintained cohesion in the face of chariot charges, blunted by javelins and rapid lane-opening maneuvers. The Immortals, tied to the king's position, watched as the carefully planned symmetrical battle dissolved into a series of localized crises that the cumbersome Persian command system could not manage in real time. Again, the decisive blow came when Alexander saw and seized a fleeting opportunity. As Persian cavalry on one flank surged too far in pursuit, a gap opened between that wing and the center, where Darius and his elite guards stood. Alexander hurled his companion cavalry straight into this opening, driving toward the king as the Macedonian phalanx pressed the Persian infantry frontally. The Immortals braced for impact, forming layers around Darius, spears outward, shields overlapping. They fought with all the ferocity of their forebears, some dying within arm's reach of the royal chariot in efforts to block the charging Macedonians. But structural realities could not be wished away. The long Macedonian lances pierced into their ranks before they could close. Companion cavalry, armored and battle-hardened, crashed against their lines with momentum enhanced by perfect timing and leadership. Flanking pressure from other Macedonian elements began to bend the Persian center. The Immortals' training in maintaining formation under pressure allowed them to slow the collapse, but they could not reverse it. Alexander's army functioned as a single coherent system. The Persian host, despite bravery and numbers, remained an agglomeration of contingents struggling to respond to rapidly shifting conditions. Once again, Darius chose flight over capture or death. Seeing Macedonian cavalry breaking through and fearing encirclement, he abandoned his chariot and fled the field, reportedly on horseback, protected by remnants of his guard. The symbolism was catastrophic. For the second time, in the two most important battles of his reign, the great king turned his back on his army and left them leaderless in the decisive moment. The Immortals, who had been created to anchor royal authority and project unshakable confidence, now witnessed that authority crumble at precisely the moment when their sacrifice might have had meaning. The collapse of Persian morale at Gaugamela was total. Units that had fought bravely now dissolved into rout. Some contingents surrendered en masse, others scattered to their homelands. The Immortals, reduced in number and shattered in spirit, could not impose order on a battlefield transforming into chaos. Whatever cohesion remained focused solely on keeping the fleeing king alive long enough to escape immediate capture. In that narrow sense, they succeeded, but at the cost of the empire's military credibility and soon its existence as an independent power. In the aftermath, as Alexander advanced through Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, the practical existence of the Immortal Guard faded. Some members submitted to the new ruler, entering his service in various capacities. Others disappeared in the general disintegration of Achaemenid institutions. Without a Persian great king to guard, the unit's reason for existence vanished. Alexander retained and reorganized parts of the Persian administrative and military systems, but the Immortals, as a distinct formation, did not survive in recognizable form under Macedonian rule. Their traditions were absorbed, their equipment repurposed, their veterans scattered or integrated into new structures. Yet even as the institution dissolved, the name and idea of the Immortals refused to die. Greek and later Roman writers preserved stories of the 10,000 elite Persians whose ranks never diminished. The memory of the Guard persisted longer than the empire that had created it, echoing in later attempts by rulers to fashion their own invincible bodyguards. Officially, the Immortals vanished with the conquest of Persia. Unofficially, they began a second life, as legend, as symbol, and as a model that future empires would imitate, misunderstand, and reinvent. And in that afterlife, beyond the ruins of Persepolis and the silence of abandoned parade grounds, the question remained: how does a mortal army become truly immortal in human memory, even when its spears have long since turned to dust? Persian discipline and Spartan austerity represented fundamentally different philosophies of military excellence. Spartans built their system on deprivation, minimal food, harsh conditions, constant hardship designed to forge warriors who could endure anything. The Agoge training system stripped away comfort to reveal essential martial qualities underneath. In contrast, Persian discipline emerged from privilege and pride. Immortals received superior rations, better quarters, and higher status because the empire believed excellence deserved reward. Both systems produced elite soldiers, but Spartans viewed suffering as virtue, while Persians saw material comfort as enhancing rather than corrupting military capability. The tactical contrast proved equally stark. Spartans specialized in one thing executed to perfection: the phalanx formation with heavy bronze armor, large shields, and long spears. Their entire society existed to produce hoplites capable of holding formation under any conditions. The Immortals pursued versatility instead, combining archery, spearfighting, and coordination with cavalry into a flexible combined arms approach. When these philosophies collided at Thermopylae, terrain determined outcomes. In the narrow pass, Spartan specialization triumphed over Persian adaptability because the situation eliminated variables where versatility mattered. Yet neither approach proved universally superior. Spartans struggled on broken terrain, or against enemies who refused direct engagement, their rigid system lacking adaptability. The Immortals excelled in open battlefields where they could employ their full tactical repertoire, but suffered when forced into pure infantry melees against heavier-equipped opponents. The real lesson wasn't that one system exceeded the other, but that each optimized for different strategic contexts. Spartans for defensive battles on chosen ground, Persians for offensive campaigns across diverse territories requiring operational flexibility. The comparison between the Immortals and Rome's Praetorian Guard reveals instructive parallels and divergences. Both served as imperial bodyguards positioned at the heart of absolute monarchies. Both combined military effectiveness with political influence, their proximity to imperial power making them kingmakers as much as protectors. Both eventually succumbed to corruption, their elite status breeding complacency and their political entanglements undermining military effectiveness. The differences, however, mattered profoundly. The Praetorian Guard numbered far fewer, typically 9 cohorts totaling around 5,000 men versus the Immortals' fixed 10,000. Roman guardsmen served shorter terms and rotated more frequently, while Immortals often made careers spanning decades within the same institution. The Praetorians evolved into primarily political actors who occasionally fought, whereas the Immortals remained combat formations that occasionally influenced politics. Most critically, the Praetorians became infamous for selling the imperial throne to the highest bidder, their mercenary character ultimately destroying them. A level of explicit venality the Immortals never quite reached, despite their own political entanglements. Comparing the Immortals to the Ottoman Janissaries highlights both convergence and contrast across a millennium. The Janissaries, created in the 14th century CE, served as the Sultan's elite infantry and personal guard, functions mirroring the Immortals' dual role. Both units combined privilege with fierce loyalty. Both eventually gained political power that threatened the very rulers they protected, and both declined as internal corruption and resistance to reform undermined their effectiveness. Yet the Janissaries surpassed the Immortals in several respects. Their Devshirme recruitment system, taking Christian boys, converting them to Islam, and training them from childhood, created soldiers with no family loyalties, competing against unit cohesion. The Immortals, drawn from Persian and Median nobility, always carried aristocratic family allegiances that complicated their service. The Janissaries also adapted militarily more successfully, incorporating firearms and artillery when those technologies emerged, while the Immortals never evolved beyond their Bronze Age tactical paradigm. Conversely, the Immortals maintained numerical consistency through their replacement system more effectively than the Janissaries, whose numbers fluctuated wildly depending on political circumstances. The unique fusion of luxury and ferocity defined the Immortals distinctively. Most elite military formations emphasized either austere warrior culture or wealthy privilege, rarely both simultaneously. Spartans glorified poverty and suffering. Roman legionaries earned respect through endurance. Medieval knights displayed wealth but within chivalric frameworks that emphasized honor over comfort. The Immortals unapologetically combined both. They wore expensive robes and ornate armor while maintaining brutal combat effectiveness. Their spears featured gold and silver counterweights, shaped like pomegranates, decorative yet functional. This combination wasn't contradictory in Persian eyes, but complementary, beauty and deadliness, as dual expressions of imperial power. The symbolic weight of maintaining exactly 10,000 soldiers transcended mere organizational convenience. In Persian cosmology and numerology, 10,000 represented completeness and divine perfection. The number connected to concepts of cosmic order, the harmony of creation, and the fulfillment of destiny. By fixing the Immortals at precisely this strength, Persian rulers weren't just creating military efficiency, but making theological statements. These soldiers embodied perfect order made manifest, the empire's divine mandate expressed in human form. The replacement system reinforced this symbolism powerfully. Enemies never saw the Immortals diminish because casualties disappeared instantly, replaced by fresh warriors maintaining the sacred number. This created psychological effects beyond normal military intimidation. It suggested the unit existed outside natural laws, that normal concepts of attrition didn't apply, that fighting them meant confronting something approaching the supernatural. The name Immortals captured this perfectly, transforming organizational procedure into metaphysical statement. Cultural loyalty to absolute monarchy distinguished the Immortals from units serving more diffuse political systems. Roman praetorians theoretically served Rome, even while protecting emperors. Spartans served Sparta and its dual kingship. Janissaries served the Ottoman state and Islamic ideology as much as individual sultans. The Immortals served the great king personally, their loyalty concentrated entirely on the individual who embodied Persian sovereignty. This made them simultaneously more reliable as bodyguards and more dangerous during succession crises. Without a clear monarch to serve, their institutional purpose collapsed. The integration of tradition, religion, and military aesthetics created something irreducible to pure martial analysis. Zoroastrian concepts of cosmic struggle between order and chaos infused the guards' identity. They weren't merely soldiers, but warriors fighting for Arta, the principle of truth and righteousness. Their uniforms' colors and patterns carried symbolic weight, connecting them to Persian cultural history, stretching back before the Achaemenids. Their presence at religious ceremonies made them participants in sacred rather than merely civic rituals. This fusion meant the Immortals couldn't be separated from the broader cultural matrix that created and sustained them. The name's enduring legacy reveals its genius as branding before that concept existed. Immortals captured imagination in ways that accurate Persian designations never could. It suggested invincibility, permanence, and supernatural power, qualities that made compelling stories even when divorced from historical accuracy. The name survived because it served narrative purposes across cultures and centuries, adaptable to whatever meaning each era needed. Persians could emphasize disciplined replacement systems. Greeks could stress exotic foreignness. Moderns could project fantasies about special operations forces. The name accommodated all interpretations. What ultimately made the Immortals unique wasn't any single characteristic, but their successful combination of multiple elements that usually conflicted. They were elite yet numerous, privileged yet disciplined, tactically flexible yet organizationally rigid, culturally specific yet composed of multiple ethnicities, militarily effective yet politically entangled. This combination of contradictions held together through careful institutional design, substantial resource investment, and ideological frameworks that reconciled tensions other systems left unresolved. Their uniqueness lay not in perfection, but in sustained functionality across diverse challenges while embodying multiple roles simultaneously. Bodyguards and shock troops, symbols and practitioners, legends and historical actors. Few military institutions managed this balancing act even temporarily. The Immortals sustained it for 2 centuries, an organizational achievement that merits study regardless of their battlefield record. Yet understanding what made them unique raises a final question. Do the lessons they offer remain applicable to modern military organizations? Or did the Immortals represent a solution perfectly adapted to ancient conditions, but fundamentally obsolete in contemporary warfare? Can their institutional wisdom survive translation across millennia of technological and social change? Or does attempting such translation distort both the original and current reality beyond recognition? The answer determines whether the Immortals matter beyond historical curiosity, whether they offer genuine insights or merely serve as mirrors reflecting our own assumptions about military excellence back at us. The real history of Persia's Immortal Guard outgrows the legend that made them famous, revealing an institution far more complex, political and human than the image of an invincible, eternal army of 10,000 men. The Guard was not a band of mythical super warriors, but a sophisticated elite force shaped by imperial logistics, aristocratic power struggles, religious ideology, and the fragile psychology of kingship across 2 centuries of Achaemenid rule. Their story includes not only battlefield brilliance and dazzling ceremonial splendor, but also corruption, decline, and complicity in the same palace intrigues that weakened the empire they were sworn to protect. Yet the Immortals profoundly influenced how later civilizations imagined military power. Their combination of strict organization, fixed numbers, and proximity to absolute monarchy helped define the archetype of the ruler's elite guard, echoing in Roman praetorians, Ottoman janissaries, and even modern discussions of special forces and presidential security units. Their logistics, replacement system, and disciplined formations offered an early model of a professional standing army serving a centralized state, a concept that would become standard in empires long after Achaemenid Persia fell. The myth of the Immortals, carefully sustained by Greek writers, Persian art, and later nationalist and cinematic reinventions, teaches that military strength is never just about weapons and training. It is also about propaganda, symbolism, and the stories enemies and descendants choose to tell. The fixed number of 10,000, the name Immortals, the reliefs of perfectly ordered soldiers carved at Persepolis, and the dramatic defeats against Greeks and Alexander all combined to create a narrative that outlived the soldiers themselves. What survives in memory is not simply an elite unit, but an idea that power can appear eternal even when built on mortal foundations. If you want more deep-dive stories that go beyond the movie versions of history and into the real human drama of empires and their elites, make sure to subscribe and help this channel reach 2,000 subscribers. Leave a like to tell the algorithm these stories matter, and comment which portrayal of the Persians or the Immortals in films or series struck you the most, and why you think their legend refuses to die.